Hello students, welcome to Module 5.5.3, Pterophyta, the ferns. This particular group is a very interesting group. The ferns have evolved vascular tissue, but they do not have any seeds, fruits, or flowers. And so it is quite an interesting group. The etymology of the phylum name Pterophyta, Ptero, P-T-E-R-O, means wing. So these are the wing plants. This is in reference to the large leaves or fronds which ferns photosynthesize with. So let's go ahead and look at the features of this phylum. Recall that for each of the phyla that we cover, that they all possess the kingdom features. And so this is what makes this unit a little tricky, is that you have to keep track of different levels of features, so kingdom features and phylum features. So phylum Pterophyta, these are vascular plants. They have both xylem that carries water and provides support, and phloem that carries food in the form of dissolved sugars. The ferns require standing water to reproduce because the male gamete is a flagellated sperm that swims. They have a better developed cuticle than do the bryophytes, or the mosses and liverworts. Recall that the mosses and liverworts didn't have any true plant organs, and the ferns have true leaves and true roots. And although they have a stem-like structure, it's not considered to be a true stem by the technical criteria that botanists use. We have a particular term that we use for the formation of new leaves in the ferns. We call these fiddleheads or fiddlenecks. And this photograph here in the upper right shows why that is why they're called that. It looks like the carved scroll on the head of a violin or the head of a fiddle. And this occurs because one side develops faster than the other, but then it evens out and they open up and flatten out. Of course, the ferns, being plants, have alternation of generations as their life cycle, but in that life cycle, the sporophyte is dominant. When we look at a plant that you would call a fern, that is the sporophyte. And the gametophyte is smaller and not as long as lived, but it also is independent. So the phylum Pterophyta, the ferns, is the only phylum that has both an independent photosynthetic sporophyte and an independent photosynthetic gametophyte. Both stages are independent and photosynthetic. If we look at what the gametophyte looks like, the sporophyte is the fern, so in the upper left that would be a fern leaf. Here in the lower right, we can see the prothallus. Now there's a term that you need to learn. That is the name of the fern gametophyte. It's kind of this green heart-shaped flat structure that is about the size of the fingernail on your little finger, your pinky finger. So let's go ahead and look at xylem and phloem. Remember, this is the first group of plants that has vascular tissue. And so this is actually a photomicrograph, a photograph taken through a microscope, and it shows the xylem and phloem. Now, you're not going to have to draw this or anything, but I thought you might like to see it. This is at 400 times magnification. The xylem are the large red-stained cells, and this is in cross-section, so we've taken a vein of a leaf and sliced it in half and are looking in on the end. And the smaller cells that are kind of this bluish-green color on the interior are the phloem. And you should, of course, recall what they respectively carry. Let's look at the fern life cycle. This should be familiar to you. There's our line of ploidy, the kind of greenish background for the diploid portion of the life cycle, and the tan background for the haploid portion of the life cycle. Let's start with the first cell of the haploid gametophyte generation, which is a spore. And the spore was produced by meiosis. That's how we cross the line of ploidy. So the spore germinates and it grows into the prothallus, or into the gametophyte. The drawing of the gametophyte shown here in this life cycle actually shows the bottom of it, that's the surface that would be down upon the ground. these little, it really looks like a green heart. And at the point of the heart, we have these little stringy structures that are called rhizoids. They're root-like structures that anchor that down there. And there are two sets of these little bumps or nodules, and you can see that each is blown up. By the point of the heart, those are the male structures that produce the male gametophyte, and by the notch of the heart, those are the female structures that produce the female gametophyte. And as in the bryophytes, the female gametophyte is produced inside a vase-like structure that's found right there. And the male gametophyte, the male gamete, the sperm, swims to the female gamete, the egg, inside that female structure, and they fuse in the process of fertilization, crossing the line of ploidy and producing the first cell of the diploid sporophyte generation. This cell is called the zygote. It grows by mitosis, and recall where it is. It's right there in this little notch. And so in this drawing, they show it's kind of a lilac color or something, but they show the prothallus or the gametophyte fading away, and that's exactly what happens, is the sporophyte becomes much, much larger, and the gametophyte simply dies and decays, and the sporophyte then is the dominant form. And it continues to grow. And on the backside of the leaves, there are little clusters of spore-producing structures. The spore-producing structures are called sporangia, and a cluster of these sporangia is called a sorus, S-O-R-U-S. And so that's another term, in addition to prothallus, that you have to learn and associate with the fern life cycle. And so each of these sori, which is a plural of sorus, they are producing many spores. They have these special diploid cells that undergo meiosis and produce spores, thereby crossing the line of ploidy and completing the life cycle of the ferns. Now, I have a series of photographs here. It's not because ferns are more important or anything like that. I just happen to have access to photographs of the fern life cycle, and I wanted to show you actual photographs rather than a drawing like this. So let's go through this series of photographs. They're really quite spectacular. So this is underneath the sporophyte's leaf. This is a sorus, a cluster of sporangia, and you can just see them around the edge. In the middle, there's this umbrella-like structure that protects the sporangia. Here is one sporangium, and that's, of course, meiosis occurs within there. This is also the sporangium, and this time it is releasing spores that have been produced by meiosis. So the spore is the first cell of the haploid gametophyte generation. The spore germinates and grows by mitosis into a gametophyte. And this is showing the top surface, and this one's been turned over. You can see some of the little dark structures and some of the rhizoids there. This is a close-up showing the female structures, which are near the notch, and you can actually see the vase-like structure. And in the broad part of this vase is where the egg or the female gamete would be produced. It's kind of interesting. You can see that. Here we are seeing two structures. You can see the prothallus, which is a darker green structure growing right on this moist log, and growing out of some of the prothalli are the lighter green, leafier structures. This is the sporophyte that's going to grow into the adult fern, and it will overshadow the prothallus, and the prothallus will fade away. Kind of a neat series of photographs. Before we leave this particular group of plants, I want to point out to you that in terms of the history of the earth, that there was a time when the ferns and what are called the fern allies, kind of related plants, were dominant on the planet. And this was during a geological time period called the Carboniferous, and this is known as the Age of Coal, and it was about 300 million years ago. The Earth was covered with shallow seas, and temperatures were much more moderate, even tropical. As far north as Great Britain had temperatures that were more similar to southern Florida. And so this resulted in year-round luxurious plant growth. And there were 5 plant groups that really dominated. And 3 of them were seedless vascular plants, which would be ferns and fern allies. The other 2 were conifers. But here's the groups. And I don't memorize these, but it's just kind of for your information. And the reason these are so important is because they were a major source of many fossil fuels, such as coal. And, of course, as we've discussed before when we were studying photosynthesis, fossil fuels provide both a benefit and a challenge. They've been a great blessing, but also if we release the carbon all at once, it creates global warming. This is a recreation of what the forest might have looked like, the ancient forest of this time. And here's one of the inhabitants, and there we go. We can, if we just look back at this list, the first 3 on this list were seedless vascular plants. And giant horsetails, we saw horsetails in large ferns. Number 4 was the seed ferns, which is believed to be one of the lineages within that group gave rise to the seed plants. And then we had some conifers with strap-like leaves. In any case, this will conclude our coverage of the pterophytes, the ferns, and it will also conclude this module.